The first time they called me a beast, I was just 7 years old. The words tumbled from the colonial administrator's mouth like poison, his steel-gray eyes dissecting our settlement with a mixture of contempt and unease. We were the Kirill, a people branded as savage, pushed to the margins of a world that no longer recognized our humanity. Our homeworld of Ariathan had once been a living tapestry of connection and harmony. Before the Terran Expansion Corps arrived with their titanium ships and hollow promises of progress, we lived in a delicate symbiosis with the planet's intricate ecosystems. We were not primitive, despite their claims. Our understanding ran deeper than their most advanced sensors could ever penetrate. We communed with the living energy that breathed beneath stone and soil, interpreted the whispers of ancient landscapes. But understanding means nothing to those who hunger for conquest. The colonization was a surgical strike of cultural annihilation. Our sacred territories were methodically dismantled, our communication networks fractured, our children herded into re-education centers designed to erase every trace of our identity. They called it integration. We recognized it as systematic extinction. My father, coil of the thundering cord, would sit with me during those dark years of occupation. His hands, scarred from years of resistance and labor, would trace ancient patterns on my shoulder as he spoke. "They fear what they cannot control," he would say, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with restrained power. "And what they cannot control, they seek to destroy." I was different, even among the Kirill. From my earliest memories, something stirred within me, a current of energy that hummed just beneath my skin, a connection to something vast and incomprehensible. The colonial medical teams would examine me with clinical detachment, their reports filled with clinical terminology: genetic irregularity, potential biosecurity threat, continuous observation recommended. But they could never truly observe the storm brewing inside me. The settlement was more prison than home. Prefabricated structures lined with surveillance systems, patrolled by armed guards who watched us like we might transform into something unimaginable at any moment. Which, as it would turn out, was not entirely far from the truth. My mother, Elena, worked as a translator and liaison, a dangerous position that placed her between two worlds. Each day, she navigated the razor's edge between preservation and survival, fighting to maintain what remained of our cultural memory. Her eyes held stories of resistance, of a people who had survived countless attempts to erase them. The Terran corporations were strip mining our world with a brutality that went far beyond economic necessity. Massive excavation platforms tore into sacred grounds, processing facilities consumed entire mountain ranges, transforming living landscapes into industrial wastelands. This was not merely resource extraction. This was systematic destruction, a calculated strategy of cultural and ecological erasure. "They do not see us as sentient beings," my father would murmur during our quiet evening gatherings. "To them, we are nothing more than an obstacle, a resource to be processed and discarded." I was learning this lesson with brutal efficiency. Each day brought new evidence of our marginalization, new ways our people were being ground down, our spirit slowly crushed beneath the weight of colonial machinery. The colonizers had a rich vocabulary of dehumanization: primitive, backward, dangerous. But beast remained their most cherished term, a word that reduced us to something less than human, something that could be contained, controlled, eliminated without moral complexity. They did not understand the nature of what was growing within me, a power that defied their comprehension, a potential that existed beyond their limited understanding of strength, of survival, of the very fundamental nature of existence. They called us beasts. But beasts, when cornered, have been known to become something far more terrifying. And my transformation was just beginning. By the time I turned 16, the line between survival and resistance had become impossibly thin. The re-education center was a sterile nightmare of white walls and precision-engineered control. Every day was a battle, not just against the systematic erasure of our culture, but against the slow poison of internalized shame they tried to inject into our veins. Most of my fellow Kirill students had already begun to break, their eyes vacant, their movements mechanical. They were becoming exactly what the colonizers wanted: compliant, forgettable, invisible. But not me. The incident happened during what they called a cultural integration class. Dr. Revan Matthews, a thin, hawk-faced man with eyes that seemed to dissect more than observe, was lecturing about the civilizing mission of the Terran Expansion Corps. His holographic presentation displayed images of our world before colonization, each one carefully curated to show us as primitive, backwards, in desperate need of their advanced civilization. The Kirill were a pre-industrial society, Matthews droned, his voice a clinical instrument of cultural surgery, completely unable to leverage the true potential of Ariathan's resources. The Terran intervention was not just necessary, it was a moral imperative. Something inside me shifted. A tremor. A warning. My hands, resting on the cold synthetic desk, began to pulse with a strange energy. I could feel the molecules around me, not just see them, not just sense them, but truly understand their intricate dance. The metal of the desk, the plastic of the chair, the very air between us. They were speaking a language I was only beginning to comprehend. Matthews continued, oblivious to the building storm. Your people lived in a state of perpetual technological regression. The mineral-rich territories of Ariathan were essentially wasted under Kirill management. We brought progress. The first window shattered before I even realized I was angry. A fine mist of glass particles hung in the air, suspended like frozen droplets of potential. Then another window. Then another. Not violently, but with a precision that felt almost surgical. Silence descended. Matthews stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in a perfect O of shock. I wasn't touching anything. I wasn't moving. But the room was responding to something. To me. The other students stared, some in terror, some in a kind of horrified fascination. I could feel their fear like a physical texture, could almost taste the electricity of their panic. Containment protocol, Matthews whispered into his communication implant, his professional calm fracturing at the edges. Potential Class 5 biosecurity event, immediate isolation required. But isolation was something I had already mastered. Years of being an outsider, of feeling different, of sensing the world in ways no one else could. They had prepared me for this moment. My father's words echoed in my mind. They fear what they cannot control. The security response was immediate. Reinforced doors sealed the classroom. Electromagnetic dampening fields hummed to life. Standard procedure for any potential biosecurity threat, which, apparently, was now me. I should have been terrified. But a strange calm had settled over me. I understood, in that moment, that something fundamental was changing. The energy that had always lived just beneath my skin was no longer content to remain hidden. They had called us beasts for so long. Perhaps it was time they understood what that truly meant. The molecular dance around me continued. Windows remained suspended in their fractured state. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. And I was just beginning to understand the symphony of destruction and creation that lived within me. Isolation became my new reality. After the incident in the re-education center, they transferred me to a specialized containment facility, a sterile complex carved into the Rocky Mountains of northern Ariathan. It wasn't a prison, they insisted. It was a research center, a place to understand my unique capabilities. But I knew better. The facility was a marvel of Terran technological paranoia. Layers of electromagnetic shielding, molecular resonance dampeners, quantum entanglement suppressors, each system designed to contain something they feared but could not comprehend. Me. My primary handler was Dr. Arya Voss, a xenobiologist with eyes that burned with scientific curiosity. She was different from the other researchers. Where they saw a threat, she saw a puzzle. Where they wanted to suppress, she wanted to understand. "Your genetic markers are unlike anything we've ever encountered," she would say during our daily assessment sessions. Her hands would move across holographic displays, tracing the intricate patterns of my DNA, like an artist studying an impossible canvas. "The quantum coherence in your cellular structure suggests a form of bioenergetic communication we've never seen in any known species." I listened. I observed. But I revealed nothing. My mother had taught me the first rule of survival. Knowledge is a weapon that can cut both ways. The less they understood, the safer I would be. But safety was becoming a relative concept. The abilities that had emerged in the re-education center were growing, changing. I could feel the world differently now, not just as a collection of objects and spaces, but as a living, breathing network of interconnected energy. Molecules whispered their secrets. The very stone of the mountain spoke of ages past, of pressures and transformations that defied human comprehension. During one particularly intensive assessment, Dr. Voss pushed too far. "We need to understand the limits of your capabilities," she said, her voice clinical but not unkind. A series of containment barriers activated around my examination chamber. Sensor arrays hummed to life. "Please attempt to manipulate the molecular structure of this sample." She placed a piece of synthetic alloy on a reinforced analysis platform. Typical Terran technology. Designed to withstand extreme conditions, engineered for maximum durability. I hesitated. Something in me warned against full disclosure. But the energy was building. Always building. When I touched the molecular structure, not physically, but through that strange connection I was beginning to understand, the alloy didn't just change, it transformed. Layers of molecular bonds rearranged themselves. What had been a rigid engineered material became something fluid, something alive. The observation team went silent. Dr. Voss's hand trembled slightly as she reviewed the data. "Impossible," she whispered. But the holographic displays told a different story. The alloy had restructured itself at a fundamental level, creating a material that defied every known principle of physics. I felt their fear before I saw it. Fear and something else. Excitement. Fascination. "Do you understand what you've done?" Dr. Voss asked, her professional calm fracturing. I understood more than she could imagine. My people had always known that the universe was more complex than the colonizers could comprehend. We had always been more than they could see, more than they could control. And now, I was becoming living proof of that truth. They called us beasts. But beasts adapt. Beasts survive. And I was just beginning to show them what survival truly meant. Freedom came in the most unexpected way, through an act of collective desperation. The mining riots began on a day when the planet itself seemed to hold its breath. My father had always said that Ariathan was more than just a planet. It was a living entity, and it was dying. The Terran Expansion Corps had been strip mining our world for decades, extracting minerals with a ruthlessness that went beyond economic necessity. This was systematic destruction, a calculated attempt to bleed our homeworld dry. I was still confined in the research facility when the first reports came in. Chiral workers from the southern mining complexes, had finally reached their breaking point. What started as a work stoppage quickly escalated into something far more profound, a full-scale uprising that spread like wildfire across the industrial zones. Dr. Voss was different that morning. Her usual clinical demeanor had been replaced by something raw, almost vulnerable. "They're saying it's a coordinated rebellion," she muttered, more to herself than to me. The holographic displays around her flickered with images of chaos, burning processing plants, overturned transport vehicles, Chiral workers standing united against the corporate security forces. I felt something stir inside me, a connection deeper than blood, deeper than memory. The facility went into immediate lockdown. But lockdowns, I was learning, were more a matter of perspective than actual prevention. My understanding of the world had changed dramatically in the weeks since the molecular transformation incident. I could feel the energy of the facility, not just see it, but truly comprehend its intricate molecular dance. The electromagnetic shields, the quantum suppressors, the reinforced walls. They were nothing more than a complex arrangement of molecules, and molecules, I had discovered, were remarkably willing to listen. When the first breach occurred, it wasn't dramatic. Just a subtle realignment, a microscopic shift that would cascade into something much larger. The primary security grid failed first, then the backup systems, then the emergency protocols. It was like watching a complex machine slowly disassemble itself, each component losing its predetermined purpose. Dr. Voss turned to me, her eyes wide. "What are you doing?" I said nothing. But I was doing everything. The riots had awakened something in me, a connection to my people that transcended the physical. I could feel their collective rage, their generations of suppressed pain, their desperate hope for liberation. And in that moment, I understood that my abilities were not just about personal survival. They were about something much larger. My father's words echoed in my mind. They fear what they cannot control. Control was becoming a fluid concept, but computational commands, I was learning, were just another form of communication, and communication could be redirected. As the ships entered high orbit, something extraordinary happened. Their systems began to shift, not fail, not break, but transform. Weapons arrays realigned. Navigation systems rewrote their own protocols. Quantum communication networks dissolved and reformed into something entirely new. My mother understood first. "It's not destruction," she said, watching the orbital displays. "It's conversion." The battlecruisers, those symbols of imperial might, became something else entirely. Their metal skin began to absorb and redistribute energy in patterns that defied known physics. Weapons of war transformed into conduits of communication, of connection. Dr. Voss could barely articulate what she was witnessing. "This is impossible," she repeated, a phrase that had become almost a prayer of scientific disbelief. But impossibility was our native language. The Chiral resistance was no longer just a movement. We were becoming a fundamental force of planetary transformation. Every system the colonizers had built, economic, military, communication, was being rewritten from within. My father approached me, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that transcended words. "They called us beasts," he said quietly. "But beasts understand survival in ways civilization forgets. We adapt. We transform." I was beginning to understand the true nature of our resistance. It wasn't about defeating the colonizers. It was about showing them a different way of existing, a way that recognized the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. The orbital displays continued to shift. Battlecruisers that had once represented destruction now pulsed with a kind of living energy. Communication networks that had been designed for control now became channels of mutual understanding. They had tried to contain us, to define us, to reduce us to something manageable. But management, I was learning, was just another form of limited perception. As the first transformed battlecruiser began to descend towards the planet's surface, I realized we were writing a new chapter of existence. Not just for the Kirill, not just for Ariathan, but for everything. They called us beasts. We were showing them something far more terrifying. We were showing them possibility. Transformation has its own language, its own rhythm, and its own price. The weeks following the orbital incident became a crucible of change. Our resistance was no longer just a movement. It had become a living, breathing entity that defied every conventional understanding of rebellion, of power, of existence itself. The Terran Central Command initially responded with denial, then confusion, then something that bordered on existential terror. Their most advanced quantum communication networks began to shift, not collapse, not fail, but evolve. Information streams that once carried directives of control now pulsed with a strange new form of consciousness. It was as if the very infrastructure of colonial power was being rewritten from within, transforming into something that could not be contained, could not be controlled. Dr. Voss spent countless hours trying to document what was happening. Her scientific training was both a blessing and a curse. She could observe, but true understanding seemed to slip through her fingers like quantum particles. "You're not just changing systems," she would say, her holographic displays dancing with impossible data patterns. "You're fundamentally altering the nature of information itself." But it wasn't just about technology. The transformation ran deeper. Our people, the Kirill, were changing too. Not physically, not immediately, but in ways that defied traditional understanding. Children born in the months after the uprising displayed abilities that went beyond my own. Communication that transcended language. An intuitive understanding of the planet's living systems that made our previous connection seem like a mere whisper. My mother was the first to truly articulate what was happening. "We are not destroying," she explained during a gathering of Kirill elders and the few sympathetic Terran researchers who remained. "We are remembering a way of existing that was always possible, but forgotten." The planetary ecosystem began to respond in ways no one could have predicted. Areas that had been strip-mined for generations started to regenerate at an impossible rate. Mineral-depleted landscapes bloomed with vegetation that seemed to combine biological complexity with something almost technological. It was as if the planet itself was healing, using the very systems of destruction as raw material for renewal. The facility's outer walls began to shift, not break, not crumble, but transform. Molecular structures rearranged themselves, creating new pathways, new possibilities. It was less an act of destruction and more an act of radical reimagining. Dr. Voss watched in a kind of horrified fascination. "This is impossible," she whispered. But impossibility had become my native language. When the first Kirill resistance fighters breached the facility, they found me standing in the center of what had once been a high-security containment zone. The walls around me had become something else entirely, a lattice of transformed matter that seemed to breathe with its own consciousness. My mother was among the first to reach me. Elena had always been a master of subtle resistance, a negotiator who understood the power of words and connections. But today she looked different. Today, she looked like a warrior. "They've pushed too far this time," she said, her hand finding mine. The connection was immediate, not just physical but something deeper. I could feel the generations of resistance flowing through her, the accumulated wisdom of a people who had survived countless attempts at erasure. The mining riots were more than just a rebellion. They were a planetary uprising. Terran corporate communication channels were flooding with reports of complete system failures. Mining complexes offline, transport networks disrupted, communication grids collapsing. It wasn't just resistance, it was a fundamental restructuring of power, and I was at the center of it. Dr. Voss approached me, her previous scientific detachment replaced by something more complex. Fear, respect, understanding. "You're not just changing things," she said quietly. "You're rewriting the fundamental rules of interaction." I understood now what my parents had always known. Our resistance was never just about survival. It was about reclaiming our right to exist, to define ourselves, to transform the very systems designed to destroy us. They had called us beasts for generations, primitive, uncontrollable. Now we were going to show them what true power looked like. The facility around us continued to shift and breathe, a living testament to the possibility of radical transformation. And this was just the beginning. The aftermath of our uprising was nothing like anyone expected. It wasn't a conventional victory. Not in the way the history books would later describe planetary rebellions. What we'd unleashed was something far more profound. A fundamental restructuring of reality itself. In the weeks following the facility breach, the Terran Expansion Corps found themselves confronting something beyond military strategy or technological superiority. Their entire paradigm of control was unraveling, and I was at the epicenter of that unraveling. My abilities had evolved beyond anything the researchers could comprehend. It wasn't just about manipulating molecular structures anymore. I could feel the very fabric of interconnectedness, the quantum entanglement that bound matter, energy, and consciousness. Where they saw boundaries, I saw possibilities. The first global communication came unexpectedly, not through traditional channels, but through a network that seemed to transcend technological infrastructure. My mother and a group of Kiral elders had gathered in a hidden sanctuary deep within the mountain ranges. As they discussed our next move, I realized I could perceive their conversation without being physically present, not through sound, but through a more fundamental form of communication. "The corporations won't retreat easily," my father warned, his voice carrying the weight of generations of resistance. "They'll escalate. They always do." He was right. The Terran response came swiftly, not with military force, not immediately, but with something far more insidious: economic sanctions, communication blockades, a systematic attempt to isolate and strangle our resistance. But isolation had been my entire life, and I had learned that boundaries were nothing more than a matter of perspective. Dr. Voss remained with us, her allegiance now a complex tapestry of scientific curiosity and genuine understanding. "Your abilities," she would say, studying me with a mixture of fear and fascination. "They're rewriting our understanding of quantum interaction." I was learning to listen. Not just to human communication, but to the planet itself. Ariathan was alive in ways the colonizers could never understand. Every molecule, every geological formation, every living system was interconnected, and I was becoming the conduit for that connection. The first true demonstration of our capabilities came when the Terran fleet arrived in orbit. 12 massive battlecruisers, each capable of planetary bombardment, each a testament to technological might. They represented the ultimate expression of colonial power. Weapons that could reduce entire continents to ash with a single computational command. My father watched these changes with a mix of wonder and deep ancestral understanding. "They never understood," he would say, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate with the ground beneath our feet. "Conquest is always a form of forgetting. We are teaching them how to remember." But remembering is not a gentle process. The first true test came when the Terran Central Command decided to escalate, not with conventional weapons, not with military force, but with something far more insidious: a full-scale molecular disruptor field, a technology designed to break down matter at its most fundamental level. They would later claim it was a defensive measure, a last-ditch effort to contain the planetary transformation. We knew it for what it really was. Fear. As the disruptor field approached, a massive wave of energy that would have reduced entire continents to atomic dust, something extraordinary happened. I felt the approach before anyone else, not as a threat, but as a form of communication. The molecular disruptor wasn't just a weapon, it was a message, a desperate attempt to reassert control, and messages, I was learning, could be answered in unexpected ways. The field didn't destroy, it didn't fail, it transformed. Where it should have annihilated matter, it instead became a conduit of information, of connection. The very energy designed to break apart instead began to weave together. Molecular structures that should have been obliterated instead found new patterns of existence. Dr. Voss could only watch in stunned silence as her most advanced monitoring equipment struggled to comprehend what was happening. "This is impossible," she whispered. The phrase had become a mantra of scientific desperation. But impossibility was our native language. My mother's hand found mine. The connection was immediate. Generations of resistance, of survival, of profound understanding flowing between us. "They called us beasts," she said, her voice carrying the weight of our entire history. "But beasts understand something civilization forgets. We were not destroying the old systems. We were teaching them how to live." As the transformed disruptor field began to dissipate, leaving behind landscapes that defied every known principle of physics, I understood something profound. This was not an ending. This was a beginning. Dialogue requires listening. And we had been silent for far too long. The global transformation entered its most critical phase 6 months after the disruptor field incident. What had begun as a planetary uprising had become something far more complex, a fundamental reimagining of existence itself. Terran diplomatic vessels began to arrive, not as instruments of control, but as something closer to emissaries. Their approach was different now, hesitant, almost respectful. Dr. Voss had become our primary translator, not just of language, but of entire systems of understanding. She stood beside me as the first diplomatic shuttle descended onto the newly transformed landscape of our central communication hub. The terrain around us was no longer recognizable by any previous standard. Living circuits of biometallic vegetation pulsed with energy, communication nodes that looked like a hybrid of technological infrastructure and organic growth reached toward the sky. "They want to understand," she said quietly, her scientific detachment replaced by something more profound. "Not control, understand?" The shuttle's exterior began to shift even before it fully landed, its molecular structure responding to the environment in ways that would have been impossible months earlier. Where once there would have been rigid separation, now there was conversation, adaptation, communication. My father watched from a distance, his eyes holding generations of resistance, of survival. My mother stood beside him, her hand resting on the living circuitry that now served as our communication network. The diplomatic team that emerged was unlike any previous colonial delegation. Half of them were Terran. Half were something else entirely. Hybrid representatives who seemed to have been fundamentally changed by the planetary transformation we had initiated. Their lead representative was a woman named Commander Elena Reyes, no relation to my mother, but carrying a similar weight of understanding. "We are here to listen," she said. Not as a diplomatic platitude, but as a genuine statement of intent. I could feel the layers of communication happening simultaneously. Not just the words spoken, but the quantum entanglement of intention, of history, of possibility. "Listening is more than hearing," my mother responded. "It is a form of becoming." The diplomatic discussions that followed defied every previous model of interspecies negotiation. It wasn't about territory. It wasn't about resources. It was about reimagining the very nature of coexistence. Dr. Voss documented everything, her scientific instruments struggling to capture a form of communication that existed beyond traditional measurement. Quantum resonance, molecular dialogue, information exchanges that happened faster than thought, more profound than language. "We misunderstood everything," Commander Reyes admitted during one of our early discussions. Colonization was never about expansion. It was about a fundamental failure to communicate, to understand. The Terran representatives brought with them a catalog of their own transformations. Entire corporate structures had dissolved. Military hierarchies had been replaced by collaborative networks. The very concept of centralized control had become obsolete. We had done more than resist. We had shown them an entirely new way of existing. My abilities had become something more than individual power. I was a conduit, a bridge, a living translation of possibility. "You called us beasts," my father said during one crucial moment of negotiation. "But beasts understand survival in ways civilization forgets. We adapt. We transform." The living circuitry around us pulsed in agreement. Molecular structures shifted. Information flowed. What was happening was beyond diplomacy, beyond resistance. It was a fundamental reimagining of consciousness itself. As the sun set on our transformed landscape, casting light on diplomatic representatives who were more hybrid than pure, I understood something profound. This was not a victory. This was an invitation to something entirely new. Time loses meaning when you understand connection. Years had passed since the transformation, not decades, not in the traditional sense, but epochs of understanding that reshaped everything we thought we knew about existence, about consciousness, about the very fabric of reality. I no longer existed as a singular being. None of us did. The boundary between the chiral, the transformed Terran representatives, and the living ecosystem of Ariathon had become something else entirely. A collective consciousness that defied previous understanding of individuality, of species, of life itself. My parents had become something more than memory, more than ancestors. They were living threads in a vast network of understanding that pulsed with the rhythm of planetary consciousness. Dr. Voss, who was no longer simply a researcher, no longer purely human, stood beside me as we observed the latest planetary transformation. What had once been barren mining complexes now breathed with living networks of biotechnological ecosystems, communication nodes that resembled neither technology nor organic life, but something magnificently in between. "We were wrong about everything," she said, her voice a quantum resonance that carried meanings beyond sound. "Survival was never about conquest. It was always about conversation." The universe had been listening, and we had finally learned how to speak its language. Terran historical archives would later struggle to document what happened, how a planetary rebellion became a fundamental reimagining of existence, how beings once classified as beasts had taught an entire civilization the true meaning of evolution. We had not defeated the colonizers. We had transformed them. Every system they had built, economic, military, communicative, had been rewritten. Not through destruction, but through a profound act of mutual understanding. The very concept of colonization had become obsolete, replaced by a model of existence that recognized the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. My mother's wisdom echoed through the living networks. They never understood that boundaries are just another form of limited perception. The children born during and after the transformation were something entirely new. Not human, not chiral, not anything that could be defined by previous taxonomies. They were living bridges of possibility, quantum beings who understood communication as a form of creation. Commander Reyes, who had long since transcended her original role, approached me. Or perhaps I approached her. Directionality had become a quaint concept. "We thought we were bringing civilization," she said, her form shimmering between molecular states. "We didn't realize we were being invited to remember. Remember. Not learn, not understand. Remember." As if somewhere, in the vast quantum landscape of possibility, we had always existed this way, waiting to be recalled. The living circuitry of the planet pulsed. Memories flowed. Possibilities danced. They had called us beasts. We had shown them divine power, but divine power was never about domination. It was about connection, about seeing the fundamental truth that everything is alive, everything communicates, everything transforms. As the sun set on a world that was no longer a planet, but a living, breathing network of possibility, I understood our ultimate transformation. We were not conquerors. We were not victims. We were invitation, pure and simple, an invitation to become.